The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it. It wasn't that I didn't know what was inside. I had requested the records myself, paid the $47 processing fee, filled out the notarized form my attorney had walked me through twice. I knew exactly what was in there. I just wasn't ready for knowing to become real. Let me back up. My brother Theo, wait, I need to check the names list. Let me use completely fresh names. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it. It wasn't that I didn't know what was inside. I had requested the records myself, paid the $47 processing fee, filled out the notarized form my attorney had walked me through twice. I knew exactly what was in there. I just wasn't ready for knowing to become real. Let me back up to the beginning because none of this makes sense without the house. The house on Keller Road was the kind of place that looks like a childhood from the outside. Wide front porch, a maple tree in the yard that turned the color of fire every October, a mailbox my grandfather had built himself from a coffee can, and a cedar post that somehow outlasted everything else. Inside, it was where my mother, Nadine, had grown up, where she had brought my father home to meet her parents, where she had given birth to both me and my older brother in the same upstairs bedroom 31 years apart. It was the Whitmore family house, and the understanding, never spoken, never written down, simply absorbed through the air of every family gathering, was that it would stay in the family. When my grandmother passed 4 years ago, she left the house to my mother outright. My grandfather had been gone for a decade by then. There were no contested claims, no complicated conditions. It was a clean transfer, simple as handing someone a key. My mother's name was Nadine. She was 63 when her memory started to slip, and 65 when the neurologist used the word progressive in a sentence that made the room go cold. By then, my brother Harlan had already started making phone calls I didn't know about. Harlan is 9 years older than me. We were raised in the same house, by the same parents, and I spent most of my childhood not understanding why he moved through our family like a guest who had decided to redecorate without asking. He was loud in the way that certain men learn to be loud, not because they have more to say, but because volume has always worked for them before. He borrowed money from our parents with the casual confidence of someone who never intended to pay it back and was never asked to. He missed holidays and explained it afterward with stories that shifted details depending on who was listening. Our mother forgave him on a schedule so reliable you could set a calendar by it. I was the quiet one, the one who drove her to appointments, who refilled her prescriptions, who learned the names of her doctors and sat in on the conversations they had with her when her answers started coming out sideways. I was also the one who paid the property tax on the Keller Road house the year she forgot to, who arranged the lien release, who organized the file of documents that had been sitting in a shoebox in her hall closet since 1987. I did not do these things expecting anything in return. I want to be clear about that. I did them because she was my mother and she needed them done, and I was there. What I did not know, while I was doing all of that, was that Harlan had been busy too. The first sign that something was wrong came from a neighbor, a woman named Opal who had lived across from the Keller Road house since before I was born. She called me on a Thursday morning to ask if I had been by recently because she had seen a man she didn't recognize walking the property with a clipboard and a camera. I told her I didn't know anything about that. She paused and said, "Well, I thought you should know," and left it there. I drove by that afternoon. The house looked the same from the street, but there was a small orange flag stuck in the corner of the lawn near the sidewalk, the kind surveyors use. I called my mother. She didn't pick up. I called Harlan. He picked up on the second ring, which should have told me something because Harlan typically let calls go to voicemail unless he wanted something. He said he'd been looking into selling the house since Mom couldn't realistically maintain it on her own anymore. He said he'd talked to a realtor, just exploratory. He said it made sense to get ahead of these things. He said this with the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone he considered slow. I asked him if he'd talked to our mother about this. He said she understood the situation. I asked what that meant. He said, "Lenora, she's not going to get better, and I think we both know that." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. Lenora is me. I should have said that sooner. I'm 34, I live in Asheville now, though I grew up in Greensboro and I work as a paralegal for an estate and family law firm. which means I know just enough about what can go wrong with property and inheritance to have spent the next 72 hours genuinely frightened. I drove to the Keller Road house that weekend. My mother was in one of her clearer stretches. We sat on the porch with iced tea, and I asked her, carefully, whether she and Harlan had talked about selling the house. She looked at the maple tree for a long moment. Then she said, "I signed some papers last month." He said it was for the taxes. My stomach dropped through the porch floor. I asked her if she still had copies of what she had signed. She didn't. I asked if she remembered what the papers said. She said they were a lot of words, and Harlan had been in a hurry. I drove back to Asheville that night and called my colleague, Winsome, first thing Monday morning. Winsome had been a paralegal for 22 years and had the specific, unhurried calm of someone who has seen every variety of family go wrong. I told her what I knew. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. "Has the deed been checked?" I pulled the Guilford County property records that afternoon. The deed on the Keller Road house had been transferred 8 weeks earlier. My mother's name was gone. The property was now held by an LLC I had never heard of, Ridgeline Asset Holdings, with a registered agent address in Charlotte that turned out to be a mailbox at a UPS store. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself move. The way it had worked, as I pieced it together over the following weeks, was not complicated. It was just quiet. Harlan had obtained a power of attorney document, had it notarized at a place that apparently did not ask many questions, and had used it to transfer the property to the LLC, which he controlled. The price recorded on the deed was $62,000, which was approximately a third of the house's actual assessed value. The money had been transferred to an account in our mother's name and then moved out of it within 4 days. My mother, in one of her harder weeks, had signed several documents she had not fully read. One of them was the power of attorney. She did not remember signing it. I found an attorney named Rosalind. She worked out of a small office near downtown that had too many plants and not enough chairs, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain that she took on and off constantly while she reviewed documents. She did not seem alarmed by what I showed her, which alarmed me. She said this pattern had a name and a paper trail and that the paper trail was recoverable if we moved quickly. She said the notarization looked irregular. She said the timeline of the transfer relative to my mother's documented cognitive decline was something the court would want to look at carefully. She said the most useful thing I could do right now was gather every document I could find and let her worry about the legal architecture. I became very good at gathering documents. I requested my mother's medical records going back 3 years, which showed a documented diagnosis and a clinical note from her neurologist stating that as of 11 months prior to the transfer, she was showing moderate impairment in executive function and short-term recall. I obtained the original deed, the transfer documents, the LLC registration, and the notarization record. Rosalind's investigator traced Ridgeline Asset Holdings to Harlan through 2 layers of paperwork that looked opaque until they weren't. And then there was the recording. My mother had an old tablet on the kitchen counter that she used primarily to play solitaire and watch cooking videos. Her home health aide, a woman named Essie who had been coming 3 mornings a week for almost a year, had helped her set it up. What I did not know until Essie called me in late November was that several months earlier, after Harlan's first visit about the papers, my mother had asked Essie to help her record something. She had sat at the kitchen table with the tablet propped against the sugar bowl, and she had talked for 11 minutes. She said her name. She said the date. She said that her son Harlan had been asking her to sign papers and that she was not always sure what the papers said. She said that the house was supposed to stay in the family, that her mother had been clear about that and she had always been clear about that, and that she did not want it sold. She said she was telling this to the recording because she was worried she would forget she had said it, and she wanted there to be a record of the day she still knew what she wanted. Essie had kept the file on a thumb drive in her coat pocket for months, not certain what to do with it, not certain if it would matter. When I came to pick up some of my mother's medications in November, Essie had handed me the drive without saying much. Just, "Your mother asked me to hold on to this. I think she meant for you to have it." I sat in my car outside the house and watched the recording on my phone. My mother was wearing her blue cardigan. Her hands were folded on the table. She looked tired but entirely herself, her voice steady, her eyes looking directly at the lens the way she looked at things she was serious about. I drove directly to Rosalind's office. Rosalind watched the recording twice. Then she took her reading glasses off and set them on the desk and said, "This changes things considerably." The legal process that followed was not fast and it was not clean, and there were weeks when I ate bad takeout at my kitchen table surrounded by papers and wondered if I had the stamina for it. Rosalind filed a petition to void the transfer on grounds of undue influence and lack of capacity. She submitted the medical records and the recording as evidence. The irregular notarization became its own separate thread of inquiry that I did not fully understand, but that made Rosalind visibly satisfied in a way that felt meaningful. Harlan hired an attorney. His attorney sent letters that used a lot of formal language to say, essentially, that my mother had understood what she was signing and that the transfer had been lawful and that I was acting from grief and should consider grief counseling. I read those letters with a steadiness that surprised me. I had spent enough time in estate litigation to know that aggressive correspondence from the opposing side usually meant they were worried. There was a mediation in January. I sat on one side of a conference table with Rosalind. Harlan sat on the other side with his attorney and a yellow legal pad on which he had written things I couldn't read from across the table. He did not look at me when he came in. He looked at his attorney, then at the mediator, then at the window. The mediator was a woman in her 60s who had the particular skill of making every statement sound like a question and every question sound like an observation. She kept the conversation moving without seeming to push it anywhere. Rosalind spoke precisely and without excess. Harlan's attorney spoke at length. Harlan himself said 3 things I remember. He said he had been trying to protect our mother's assets. He said the house was a financial burden she couldn't sustain. He said I had always had a problem with the way he handled family finances. That last one sat in the room for a moment. I said, "What I have a problem with is a power of attorney obtained while our mother had documented moderate cognitive impairment, used to transfer her primary asset to an LLC you control at 33 cents on the dollar." His attorney touched his arm. Harlan looked at the window again. We did not reach a full resolution at mediation, but Harlan's attorney called Rosalind the following week, and the conversation shifted register. 3 weeks later, we received a proposed settlement. Ridgeline Asset Holdings would transfer the property back to my mother's name. The $62,000 would be returned to her account minus documented fees, with Harlan absorbing those costs. The LLC would be dissolved. Harlan would acknowledge in writing that the transfer had not followed proper procedure. He would not acknowledge fraud. Rosalind said that was common and that I should think about whether I needed the word or the result. I thought about it for 2 days. I chose the result. The deed was restored in February. I flew to Greensboro and drove out to Keller Road on a Tuesday afternoon when the air still had winter in it. My mother was sitting on the porch in her coat with a blanket across her lap, watching the maple tree the way she always had. Essie was inside, making soup. The orange surveyor's flag was long gone. I sat down beside her and we didn't talk for a while. She asked me eventually if everything had worked out with the paperwork. I said yes. She nodded as if she had not been particularly worried, which maybe she hadn't been. Memory is strange, that way. She had forgotten most of the specific fear while the recording she'd made months ago had remembered it for her. I told her about the recording. I told her she had thought to do that herself, on a day when she was scared and wanted to be heard, and that it had mattered enormously. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, I've always tried to be clear about what I want." I went back inside and found the sugar bowl still sitting on the kitchen counter where she had propped the tablet against it. I stood there for a long time. I had spent my professional life helping other people navigate what happens when families collapse around property and money and the particular grief of watching someone become less themselves. I was good at the paperwork. I was good at the details and the timelines and knowing which documents to request. What I had not understood before this was what it felt like to be on the other side of the table, to be the one whose name was on the petition, to be the one who needed the recording to exist. Harlan and I have not spoken since the settlement. I don't know if we will. There is a version of this where I grieve that separately and privately, and I think that version is probably the one I'm living. You don't stop being someone's sibling because the relationship was always slightly wrong. You just stop expecting it to be what it wasn't. My mother is still in the house on Keller Road. Her good days are fewer, and her hard days are harder, and the shape of what comes next is a conversation Rosalind and I have been having carefully and in advance. There is a proper power of attorney now, the kind that was drafted in a law office with a witness present, with my name on it and the right provisions in place. There is a will that says clearly what she wants and has been reviewed by 2 attorneys and filed with the county. There is a plan. What I think about sometimes, late, when I'm at my desk and the work is done and the apartment is quiet, is my mother at that kitchen table with the tablet propped against the sugar bowl, tired, clear, talking to a recording because she knew she might not always be able to talk to me. She had been afraid she would forget what she wanted, so she made it impossible to lose. I don't know if that's what love looks like from the outside, but from where I'm standing, it looked like someone who knew her time was limited and spent some of it making sure the truth would still be there after she couldn't hold on to it herself. The maple tree is still in the yard. The house is still in the family. Sometimes the paperwork matters. Sometimes the thing that saves everything is an 11-minute recording made on a Tuesday morning by a woman in a blue cardigan who simply wanted to be on record about what she knew. Have you ever found something that someone left behind not as a gift but as a safeguard? Something they made in a quiet moment because they knew that the moment itself might not last? I'd like to know if that's happened to you. I've thought a lot about what actually saved the house on Keller Road. Not the legal filings, not the medical records, not even Rosalind's careful methodical work, though all of that mattered. What saved it was an 11-minute recording my mother made alone at her kitchen table, on a day when she was scared and still lucid enough to know she wouldn't always be. She didn't do that because someone told her to. She did it because she understood, in whatever quiet corner of herself that fear had not yet reached, that clarity is a resource that runs out. And she spent some of hers making sure the truth would outlast her ability to hold it. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the betrayal. Though what Harlan did was a betrayal in the clearest sense of the word, not a misunderstanding, not a difference of opinion, but a deliberate act taken against someone who trusted him. I've made my peace with naming it that, but what stays with me more than the anger is my mother's foresight. The fact that she saw what was coming before I did and she did what she could with what she had. There's a kind of intelligence in that which has nothing to do with memory or credentials or how sharp your mind is on a given afternoon. It's the intelligence of knowing your own limits and working around them anyway. My mother couldn't stop Harlan from pressuring her. She couldn't always remember what she'd signed, but she could sit down on one clear Tuesday morning and speak directly to whoever might need to hear her voice later. That took courage, that took a steadiness I'm not sure I would have had in her position. What I learned from this, and I use that phrase carefully because I don't think suffering automatically produces wisdom, I think you have to choose to look at it, is that the people who protect us most aren't always the ones making the loudest noise. Harlan was loud. He had an attorney with a billboard. He used words like assets and burden and best interest as if volume and vocabulary were the same as being right. My mother spoke quietly into a tablet propped against a sugar bowl, and she was the one who won. I also learned something about the cost of patience that I hadn't understood before. I spent years being the quiet one, the useful one, the one who refilled the prescriptions and organized the files and drove the 3 hours without being asked. I used to think that was just what you did, that it didn't accumulate into anything, that showing up wasn't a form of character so much as a form of habit. I understand now that it is both. The habits we build in the ordinary years are what we have to draw on when the extraordinary ones arrive. I knew how to gather documents because I had always paid attention to details. I knew who to call because I had spent years learning which professionals could be trusted. None of that was an accident. Harlan's choices caught up with him not because the universe punishes cruelty in some tidy, poetic way. It doesn't, and I won't pretend otherwise, but because he had built a life around shortcuts and assumptions, and shortcuts have edges that eventually cut the person holding them. He assumed our mother wouldn't remember. He assumed I wouldn't look closely. He assumed the paperwork would hold. Every one of those assumptions was wrong, and they were wrong because he had never taken seriously the people he was underestimating. The house is still standing. The maple tree turned the color of fire again last October. My mother sat on the porch in her coat and watched it, and I sat beside her, and for a few minutes neither of us said anything about any of it. That felt like enough.